On the Record.
Good afternoon. Does Ken Livingstone have the right answer to our terrible transport problems? I'll be talking to him. I'll also be talking to the minister responsible for our right to know what's going on in the government. Why do they keep so much from us? And MPs are agonising over one of the great moral dilemmas. How far should we go in using human embryos for research? That's after the news, read by Peter Sissons.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. Rescue teams in Austria have postponed attempts to recover the bodies from a train that caught fire in a mountain tunnel because the site is still unsafe. More than 150 people are now thought to have died. It's been confirmed that Japanese, Americans and Germans were among the dead.
The bells rang for the dead in a small town in Austria. The community gathered for prayer, seeking some sense from such appalling carnage. Many of the dead came from this region, which draws its livelihood from the mountains.
Es gibt immer, für uns Gläubige gibt es immer Hoffnung.
For those of us who believe, there's always hope. We also know that our Lord Jesus had to suffer.
The fearful blaze in the heart of the mountain claimed the lives of almost everybody on board. The final list of fatalities may not be known for weeks. A disaster on this scale seems almost unimaginable amidst such natural beauty. There have, of course, been skiing tragedies in these mountains before, but never on this scale. It's now crucial to discover the cause of what happened here to ensure such a catastrophe can never happen again.
Election officials in Florida have decided that all the votes that were cast in Palm Beach County should be recounted by hand. The decision could overturn George W. Bush's narrow lead in Florida and give the presidency to Al Gore. An investigation's begun after 6 people were killed in a crash on the A1 in North Yorkshire. 3 of them died after being hit by an articulated lorry as they stopped to help people in an overturned car. The other 3 fatalities were passengers in the car. Heavy overnight rain has renewed concern about flooding in parts of southern England. The Environment Agency has warned that the ground is so waterlogged even an average downpour could trigger local flooding. In Chichester in West Sussex, the emergency services have laid miles of pipes to try to keep water out of the city centre.
The people of Chichester have a lot to thank these pipes for. Over the past 12 hours, they've been swallowing up the floodwaters at a rate of a gallon a second and dumping it back into a nearby lake. They've literally saved the city from going under.
From the middle of the evening, there was every possibility that we wouldn't be able to cope with the pumping in the city centre, and so we had to start the pumping here. If we hadn't have done that, Chichester would have flooded last night.
Despite the vast quantities of water being pumped away from the city centre, residents can see little difference, and a severe flood warning remains on the River Lavant.
All 13 miles of these pipes are going to keep pumping away until the water level starts to drop. And they're going to be on standby until the spring. So great is the fear of further flooding.
Scotland Yard has confirmed that it's to consider employing officers with criminal records. The Metropolitan Police, Britain's largest force, has a shortfall of 3,000 officers. It says it feels the current recruitment rules are too rigid.
This change in policy is born out of the London Police Force's severe recruitment crisis. The Metropolitan Police wants to recruit 3,000 more officers, and its tough stance on previous convictions is making that difficult. It's now considering relaxing the rules on convictions, as well as age and qualifications. But the force insists people with serious convictions will not be considered.
We are not taking criminals on in the Metropolitan Police. We're looking to see if people have got convictions for speeding or for not having a TV licence, for instance, and that type of offence, or an offence that might take place 15 years ago. I think people like that are entitled to join the police.
But it does mean officers' criminal records could become an issue when they're giving evidence in court.
The annual service for Remembrance Sunday was held in London this morning. The Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh and other members of the royal family led those laying wreaths at the cenotaph in remembrance of all those who gave their lives fighting for Britain in the last century's great conflicts. That's it. There are news bulletins every hour on BBC News 24, and I'll be back with more news at 5:05 here on BBC One. But now back to John Humphreys and On the Record.
Scientists want to use human embryos to tackle some of the most serious diseases. MPs have to decide whether that is morally acceptable. We'll be looking at the pressures on them.
To destroy that embryo for the purpose of research is an unacceptable infringement of that embryo's rights.
If I was going to choose which I'd rather, if you like, sacrifice, I'd rather sacrifice this little ball of cells than a person.
Are we really ready to break down the borders that separate the poorer Eastern European countries from the European Union? And they kept us in the dark over mad cow disease. Can we be sure that they won't do that again? But first, transport, another terrible weekend on the roads and rails. We scarcely know where our next train is coming from and when it will arrive. And you could say the same, they say, for some aspects of the government's transport policy. They used to tell us it was all about persuading us to get out of our cars. Now they're cutting the price of fuel. Well, nowhere is the transport crisis more apparent than in the capital, and nowhere is the government facing a bigger challenge over what it wants to do. The challenger is Tony Blair's bête noire, Ken Livingstone, the Mayor of London. Good afternoon, Mr. Livingstone.
Good afternoon, John.
You want to get us out of your cars. That's the essence of your plans for London, and get us to use public transport and all the rest of it. Anything but sit in our cars and clog up the city. But look at what the government is doing. It's cutting the price of fuel. It's caving into the truckers, giving them lots of things that they want. It's got a big road building programme, and so on. And you must be feeling rather isolated, mustn't you?
Well, not really. I think the government's made some concessions because we are, I think, the country that taxes its motorists the most. And I think we've reached a limit in that direction. And therefore, the sort of policies I'm looking at, which is not stopping everyone driving, we all accept, for the vast majority of people in outer London, the car will be their normal mode of getting around. What we're saying is when people come into the very densely packed centre, the norm must be that they use public transport. And it's about shifting. If we could shift 10 to 15% of people onto public transport over the next 4 or 5 years, there will be a dramatic improvement. And the more you do that, the more you're able to invest in public transport and build up a good system. A lot of European cities have good, clean, cheap, efficient buses that take business people, the middle class, increasingly. Our public transport system, particularly the buses, seems to be just for the poorest.
Just before we leave the question of the lorry drivers' protest, by the way, Sir John Stevens, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, is saying he wants to keep them out of London. You're a man who in the past has always been supportive of people's right to protest. What's your view on that? Do you want to stop them protesting in London as well?
No, anyone can come and protest. They can march through London. They can sit down outside number 10 Downing Street if they want. We all accept that. Whether or not you can allow a lot of people completely clog the roads with the whole aspect of that protest is to cause real industrial and commercial damage to London at a time when we are under real threat from fringe Republican groups that could exploit that opportunity. I actually support the Commissioner. I think, wait, leave your lorry on the outskirts and we'll let people march through London.
You take that threat seriously, do you? Because there's not been much evidence of it, has there?
No, but you see, it only takes half a dozen disaffected Republicans with a fairly sort of simplistic device to put lives at risk. I mean, we saw in the bombings in London last year from one lone psychopath the ability to make maximum damage. And so, I mean, it can be a very small handful of people. And, of course, we have to take the threat seriously. If at the middle of the lorry protest we had a warning from one of the Republican fringe groups, we would have a very difficult situation trying to clear areas if we've got gridlock caused by the lorries.
But you've not had clear intelligence that that has been threatened, or maybe?
No, but we are aware that London is the sort of main target for these splinter groups that have broken away from the IRA, and we have to be alert. They're not going to give us warning. They will strike at maximum inconvenience to us.
One thing that you are nervous about, apart from all that, obviously, very sensibly, is the fuel lobby and the threats that it makes, or at least it would appear to be the case. Certainly the government is. And as far as you're concerned, you were going to charge lorries £15 a day for coming into London. You've chopped that back to £5 a day now.
Well, the business community made the very valid point that, I mean, £5 charge for cars will discourage some people from making a journey they could make by bus or tube. But they did point out that, I mean, business vehicles aren't running around London just for sightseeing. They are delivering goods, and however high we make the charge, they'll still have to make that journey. So
on that basis, there shouldn't be a charge at all.
Well, you'd have the real problem that if you actually said there was going to be no charge for business vehicles, then some people are a bit mean, would no doubt sell their car and buy a business vehicle to run around in. So a flat charge for everyone, small enough so it's not a real burden on the commercial sector, but large enough to deter people making unnecessary journeys. I think that's right. We can only try it and see. I mean, nowhere in the world outside of Singapore, where I think it's a very different culture and a much more modern city, no major world city has tried this yet. And it's better that we go for the minimum scheme and the lowest charge, because if we can get it right at that basis, I mean, there's no point going for something higher that will just alienate people.
But isn't the political reality that it's actually not going to happen at all? I mean, you're reviewing it now, and I put the word reviewing it in quite big inverted commas, in a sense. I mean, the fact is you're not going to get the support, are you? People aren't going to say, yeah, we'll go with it. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So it's not going to happen, is it?
No, I mean, what I propose to Londoners is we've got consultation, and I will listen to what Londoners are saying, but the decision finally is mine next June after I've listened to what everyone is saying. We've already made changes, not just for the business community, but people with disabilities. But I do think it is in the best interest of London, and we are still showing the opinion polls very evenly balanced. I think no one wants to pay any more, but most Londoners who have to get around their city know you just can't go on doing nothing. If we do that, then we are building a sort of almost permanent gridlock. I mean, it used to be Saturday and Sunday, the roads are relatively clear. Now, every day of the week, virtually all day, we have congestion, and that's a terrible impact on our health. It's a huge loss to the private sector in terms of losses caused by congestion as they try and run their businesses.
You obviously want to make the tube operate more effectively in order to make all the rest of it work. And you've got a very serious problem here because the government has a plan that you do not approve of. I mean, you don't want to sell off part of the tube as they do, this public-private partnership. The truth is, there's nothing you can do, is there? Because if the government wants to do what it's going to do, it's going to do it, and that's that.
The government has the power to push this through, but I mean, John Prescott has made absolutely clear, and I saw him last week, and he's still open-minded, that this can only go ahead if it's the best value for money and if it improves safety. Now, the real doubts on both those concerns, the contracts, the final bids are in from the consortia, and John Prescott will be weighing that. Two new factors have come into play, however. One is that I've appointed Bob Kiley, who has a proven track record of management.
And who Mr. Prescott won't even talk to.
Oh, that's not talk to. I mean, all last week there were stories filling the papers. Me and John Prescott were at loggerheads over the New Year's Eve fireworks and whether the train should run. When finally we had a meeting on Friday, we both actually put the same points to the rail operators. We were in complete agreement. And I think I have demonstrated we've been able to find the best management. Clearly, you've got to bring private sector expertise in to do the bulk of the work of modernising the underground. And what I'm looking at is a way in which we can go for sort of a modified version, which will leave the chain of command, which is so important for safety, as we saw at Hatfield, in the hands of Bob Kiley, but bring in the expertise of those private sector firms to do the actual work of modernisation.
I'm a bit surprised you got on so well with John Prescott, because he'd been saying earlier in the week that you ought to stop going around, what was the word he used, waffling, and making out that you could break contracts and things, because you can't. I mean, that's what he thinks you're doing, waffling.
But that's because, I mean, you're in a TV interview, and reporters saying Ken Livingstone said this, so John Prescott said
he did say
back.
That.
Yes, but he gets a completely misinterpreted view of what I'm saying based on the media.
It's very hard to misinterpret waffling.
Well, no, but I mean, I have to say this. When I have sat down, when I've met the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister and every other Cabinet Minister I've met in the 6 months since my election, we have had no problems reaching a good working relationship and agreeing most points of dispute between us. Yeah. It doesn't play well for the media. No, I keep reading in the papers now, it's terrible. Ken Livingstone isn't in the news. There aren't great rows. Well, I mean, that isn't good government. The best government is the one that gets on and does the job.
No, but you say gets on and does the job. The fact is, they're not giving in. You want to do one thing, they want to do another, and the only thing you can do is threaten to take them to court.
They haven't made a final decision, and I think the decision of the London Labour Party conference yesterday, very much under the control of the government.
That supported you, yeah.
Well, no, they elected a government loyalist rather than one of my supporters.
No, they supported you as far as your tube policies are
Precisely.
concerned.
Here was a conference dominated by what the media would call Blairites, but on that key issue of the underground, overwhelmingly rejecting it. Now, I think Tony Blair and John Prescott will listen to this. We're 6 months away from an election. Londoners aren't persuaded. What I am offering is a reasonable compromise, world-class management and bringing in the private sector to use their expertise, but keeping the chain of command that means we'll avoid the sort of problems we had at Hatfield with no one knowing who's running what.
But if they go ahead with it, and certainly Mr Prescott's given not a whiff of a notion that he might back down on this, if they go ahead with it, I suppose it's possible, isn't it? Because you will actually be running it, they push through the law, you then have to enforce the contracts. Theoretically, it would be possible for you to scupper it, wouldn't it? Because you could be really tough on the contractors and make it very unattractive for them.
Well, I think some of the contractors assume the person running this system would be another dull old bureaucrat from London Underground. In Bob Kiley, you've got, well, no, Bob Kiley, the man I bring in from New York, understands business in a way that I certainly don't. They won't get much past him. The other thing those companies have got to recognise is if they take real power in the day-to-day running of the underground, they become part of the public political arena. Those companies will become household names. The things that go wrong, we know good people come to me saying, what's the mayor doing about this? I should say, well, what's Bechtel doing about it? What are the other big engineering firms doing? I'm not certain they've thought that through.
Have you thought through the Dome? I mean, this is apparently crisis week for the Dome, isn't it? If the chap who says he wants to take it over doesn't actually take it over this week or doesn't make a decision this week, apparently he's going to pull out. We read this morning it's possible that they will leave the Dome in darkness for a whole year or something until we all sort of forget about it, and then they'll try and do something else. What do you want to do with it?
Well, I think the current bid, the legacy bid, is a good one, and if we can make it work, we should, because it will bring high-skill jobs, a science park, business park, to an area of London which has had long-term high unemployment. I think there'll need to be some degree of public subsidy to make that work, but let's not forget, when Mrs Thatcher opened up Docklands, it cost £138,000 for each job created. We'll be able to do something to get the Dome saved with the legacy project for very much less than that, I'm certain of it. But if that does fail, then my guess is, like everything else that's going wrong in London, it'll end up being dumped on my desk.
And what will you do with it then? Will you flatten it?
No, I think that would be a terrible loss. That is a world-class building. We've got to find a way of actually utilising that site in a way that preserves the Dome.
Hard to do that, though, isn't it? If Legacy and other people are saying we need extra money in order to do it and all the rest. I mean, where are you going to find somebody to go in it? Or have you got somebody in mind?
No, I mean, I really, my staff have been working and supporting the Dome, the legacy bid for the Dome. I mean, what we really lack in London, a gap in our economy, we don't have the sort of scale of science parks and high-tech business that many other world cities have. And this would be a good site, I mean, very well connected because of the tube to get around London. And I want to try and make it work. If that fails, it is back to the drawing board. There isn't a plan C.
There isn't. You've got absolutely no notion of where. So, well, actually,
we want to make the legacy bid work if we can. If it doesn't work, then literally both my office and the government will have to sit down and look at what we can do with the remaining site. But I think it would be a tragedy for such an imaginative building to be demolished.
And this is the crisis week, isn't it? This is the crunch time.
Well, every businessman negotiating up against the deadline, I mean, has a tendency to build that up. I suspect, actually, that it might be very much like the the European Union negotiations, and they just stop the clock and pretend the week hasn't ended yet.
Should Lord Faulkner resign over it?
No, I don't think so at all. Lord Faulkner had this mess dumped in his lap when it was unsavable. I don't think anyone would have actually spent less or managed it better.
Well, what about Peter Mandelson in that case? Because it was he who sort of dumped it there by going off to do another job. And if it was a mess by then, should Peter Mandelson resign?
No, I mean, the problem was that it was never going to work. It was the wrong site to have that sort of entertainment complex. And to invest in that sort of complex for a year I mean, if someone's opening a Disney World type thing, you have your investment, very, very, very high levels of investment initially, but you plan to recover it over a decade or more. The hope of turning around that number of people and making it a paying proposition in a year, I think was never viable. You've got to look, initially I suppose you'd say, well, it's Heseltine and this grandiose, I mean, it's what politicians always want, some great monument. All the public want is actually their roads and their hospitals to work.
And occasionally the public want somebody to say, well, look, we fouled it up, so I'm going to pack my bags and go. You're saying nobody should carry the can for it?
I think someone should. The trouble is...
Well, who?
Yeah, but the trouble is on this one, it's a thing that spans governments and spans too many people. I suspect that if Tony Blair had to take that decision 2 years into his government...
Well, where Tony was the man.
He might have taken a different decision. But this was a problem dumped on the government, along with 200 other things that had to be dealt with in the first weeks of a changeover. Inevitably, mistakes are made. But I think the idea that every issue in government, the media want to resolve by someone resigning, wouldn't half make for a high turnover of politicians if the media got their way.
You're sounding, if I may say so, extremely responsible and restrained this morning. Does this imply, or does this tell us, should we read into this that you are about to make your application to rejoin the Labour Party, now that apparently Dennis Canavan, who was also slung out, is apparently going to be back in before the end of the year with a bit of luck? Is that what you're going to do?
John, I always was moderate or restrained, just not so many journalists noticed.
It's all relative, perhaps, all right.
Well, also, I'm in a day-to-day job where I deal with the government. I have to have a working relationship.
So what about the Labour Party? You're going to apply to rejoin?
I'm delighted that Dennis Canavan is coming back in. I hope to be back in myself soon. But, I mean, it's up to the Prime Minister to decide when and if he wants me back. I'm not going to keep running around sort of submitting applications as some sort of photo opportunity. I would like to be back. I mean, I'll be working for the Labour Party at the election next year, whether I'm in the party or not.
But you're not going to reapply, are you? Just to be clear about that. You're not going to put in an application.
Well, that would be a publicity stunt. I mean, as you can imagine, I am in regular contact with party officials and government ministers. This is something that bubbles along in the background. There'll be a time when it's right.
But Tony Blair hasn't yet said, Ken, come on, you can come back now.
No, but then I'm not... the objective of this is not to put the government on the spot. The objective of this is to actually try and find a way of resolving it without anyone looking as though they've had to climb down.
Ken Livingstone, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
MPs will be voting in the next few weeks on one of those issues that falls right outside party politics. They can't rely on what their party tells them to do because it'll be a free vote. It's a question of personal conscience. Should scientists be allowed to experiment on human embryos in their search for cures for some of the most crippling diseases? They're coming under enormous pressure from both sides, and the arguments could scarcely be more complex or indeed emotive. Terry Dignan reports on how they're approaching one of the most difficult decisions any politician can be asked to make.
Clive Porter has had Parkinson's disease for nearly a decade, and his condition is worsening. He's heard reports of a potentially revolutionary treatment for diseases like his. It would mean transplanting so-called stem cells into his body. But the treatment is said to require research using human embryos. Clive Porter hopes the research will go ahead and give him the chance to fight back against a disease which daily saps his strength.
This is what it's about. The concentration on moving across a room or opening a newspaper. Marion, could you fold this to the leader page, please? Okay. Not being able to get up and leave the room if I want to. Just the top half. Right, okay. That's it, thanks. Yep. That sounds like a trivial thing. But when it's gone, you miss it. Once in public, I was thought to be drunk. And that's a shattering experience. And there's nothing you can do about it.
Here we have an issue likely to cause politicians huge anguish. Many voters regard the human embryo as a human being, and they believe using embryos for research is completely unethical. They're warning it could even lead to the cloning of human beings. For members of Parliament, this is an issue of conscience, so their party leaders aren't telling them which way to vote. The lobbying of MPs is underway. With every sign, it's going to become really intense.
We take the position that the embryo, from the time of conception, from the time the embryo's life begins, is an individual who has rights. And to destroy that embryo for the purpose of research is an unacceptable infringement of that embryo's rights.
We're never going to win the argument with people from their own point of view who are very strongly against the use of embryos at all, but that is a minority view in this country, probably a minority view in Parliament, and I think we need to ensure that the majority view, and I think the scientific and majority ethical view, is translated into legislation.
Scientists argue that stem cells taken from the human embryo may be able to renew tissue damaged by disease or injury. So they want a change in the law affecting the use of surplus or spare embryos created from fertilizing a human egg with sperm by IVF, in vitro fertilization. The intention is to extract stem cells at an early stage in the development of the embryo. These embryonic stem cells are the raw material of human tissue. Scientists want to harvest them in a laboratory to treat a wide range of conditions, including Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, leukemia, heart disease, diabetes, and multiple sclerosis. At the National Institute for Medical Research, embryonic stem cells from mice are studied. This kind of work has produced a treatment for the animal equivalent of multiple sclerosis. Experts here say human embryonic stem cells offer the best hope for tackling human illnesses. Sacrificing human embryos in the process is a price worth paying, they argue.
It's a choice between taking that little ball of cells and curing people who have debilitating diseases like Parkinson's disease, like multiple sclerosis, like diabetes, individuals who suffer for years and years and years of their life in a horrible way, and their families suffer. If I was going to choose which I'd rather, if you like, sacrifice, I'd rather sacrifice this little ball of cells than a person.
But others believe that sacrificing in a laboratory test tube with the little ball of cells of the early human embryo amounts to the killing of a human being. Even MPs who don't object on religious grounds feel uncomfortable. Why can't so-called adult stem cells taken from a fully grown volunteer be used instead, they ask? That would avoid the sacrifice of a human life.
What we're talking about here is taking tiny beginnings of human beings, human life, creating it or using it from whatever source, destroying it, to create a research material. My view is that rather than take that ethical leap, that moral leap, what we ought to do is exhaust the other channels first. And one of the things that I would like to see explored is the use of adult stem cells.
But it's much less certain that treatments for diseases like Parkinson's will be found from adult stem cells, according to this expert's data. The point about embryonic stem cells is that they haven't yet specialized into the cells of the different parts of the body. The aim would be to influence their development so they can replace particular kinds of damaged cells or tissues.
An embryonic stem cell, which corresponds to a very, very early stage of an embryo, has the natural ability to give rise to all cell types in the body. An adult stem cell, on the other hand, has a very restricted potential, restricted fate.
Supporters of using human embryos for stem cell research believe they're in danger of losing the argument because of fears about human cloning. The idea of cloning conjures up a nightmare world where human beings are manufactured to order. Scientists engaged in stem cell research admit they do want to use cloning techniques, but only to clone human cells, not human beings. It's this issue which is causing many MPs, even those not opposed to using embryos for research, the most anxiety. Scientists fear the body might reject implanted stem cells just as it can reject donated organs. The answer might be to clone stem cells from the patient's own body. It would be done by removing the nucleus of a patient's adult cell. Then an embryo would be created by fusing the nucleus with a human egg, which had had its own nucleus removed. In the early stages of the embryo's development, its stem cells would be transplanted into the patient. Because the cells had been cloned from the patient, there'd be less likelihood of the body rejecting the transplant.
The whole idea of using cloning is to basically be able to allow you to have embryonic stem cells that are essentially coming from the patient, him or herself. So there will be no problems of immune rejection.
4 years ago, geneticists at the Roslin Institute near Edinburgh introduced to the world Dolly. Dolly was living proof it was possible to clone a mammal. At the offices of the anti-abortion group, the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, letters are being sent to MPs warning them that a vote in favour of using human embryos for stem cell research will lead to the cloning of a human being. The government's promise to outlaw cloning of babies is regarded by these pro-life activists as irrelevant.
It will happen. Whether it happens in this country or in another country, there's no way that the government can restrict it. Once the genie is out of the bottle, somebody somewhere is going to take it to the next step, and it's a small step and not a big one in scientific terms.
Like many MPs, Labour's Claire Ward is receiving letters not just from pro-life groups, but from constituents alarmed at reports that stem cell research will lead to cloning. Hers is a marginal seat, and hardly surprisingly, she's considering very carefully her attitude to this issue.
I'm undecided at the moment because I want to see some of the assurances that are necessary so that I can justify both to myself and to my constituents that this would not be an opportunity to take this form of research to limits that are unacceptable, such as human cloning or reproductive cloning.
We have some excellent speakers tonight.
The scientists and their allies in Parliament are worried they're not getting their message across, so they're trying to allay the fears of MPs and peers at meetings like this.
And the goal would be to be able to use such stem cells.
One of the MPs leading the battle for hearts and minds is Liberal Democrat Dr. Evan Harris. He says the government, who, like him, wants the research to go ahead, needs to spell out to its own backbenchers that the law won't allow cloning.
It is not legal in this country to do so, and the government has indicated it will introduce primary legislation to reinforce that ban. But really, the government has to actually, I think, communicate that to its backbenchers so that they're not misled by those people who use the slippery slope argument.
On the record asked MPs where they stood on stem cell research. We contacted them with the statement, "The government has said there will be a free vote later this year on whether or not to allow embryos to be used in stem cell research into human diseases, subject to the controls of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act." 76 said they would vote in favour, 54 said they would vote against, 49 were still undecided, 4 would abstain, leaving the outcome uncertain, and those lobbying both for and against with all to play for.
It'll be quite fierce, the pressure. The pressure will come from, I would guess, two different directions. There'll be those who take a very strong ethical line on the use of life, the pro-lifers, but others as well as the pro-lifers. And on the other side, there'll be people who are saying to themselves, well, my relative, my aunt, my mother, my father, whatever, has got this disease which could be treated if we did this. So there'll be people very passionate on both sides.
I think it's important that MPs are aware of both sides and recognise that if they just weigh letters, they're not on each side, the ones they get, they're not going to be able to weigh letters from those people with Alzheimer's disease, with Parkinson's disease, because it is so very difficult for those individuals to have a voice with which to lobby.
Outside Parliament, opponents of stem cell research are taking the battle to MPs' constituencies.
Would you be interested in signing a petition against human cloning?
In Evan Harris's Oxford seat, they've got a petition calling for the research to be banned. And they're warning the local MP they're going to make it an election issue.
Bye-bye. We want Evan Harris to realise that so many of his constituents believe very strongly that the cloning of embryos is wrong, and that his constituents are obviously willing to vote against him on this matter. So in that sense, it is a form of political pressure.
Clive Porter says he understands the hostility to using embryos for research which could perhaps one day transform his life. But from his point of view, the sooner the research goes ahead, the better.
The exhausting and frustrating thing is getting moving and being able to be certain that tomorrow will be a better day. Coming to terms with the fact that in all probability, unless this sort of research is allowed to be continued, tomorrow will never become a better day for people with Parkinson's.
I think members of the public understand and accept that MPs have free votes or conscience votes on a whole range of issues, and they won't always agree with their constituents on those matters. I would hope that my constituents would respect my view at the end of the day, but I think they would want to know that I could justify it and that I'd looked into it carefully and I was able to explain to them why I had either supported it or opposed it. That, I think, is crucial.
Is the destruction of a human embryo a price worth paying for research which might alleviate the suffering of someone like Clive Porter? That's the dilemma facing MPs. If they do vote in favour, they face the added risk that they could be taking a step closer to human cloning. It's not an issue politicians can hide from, especially in the run-up to a general election.
Terry Dignan reporting there. The House of Lords will vote this week on the Freedom of Information Bill, the last chance to change what many people believe is a hopelessly inadequate attempt to open up our secretive government. The report into the BSE fiasco exposed the culture of secrecy that exists in Whitehall. Well, the Home Office Minister responsible for the new law in England and Wales is Mike O'Brien. Good afternoon, Mr O'Brien.
Good afternoon, John.
You agree, I take it, with Lord Phillips that there is a culture of secrecy in Whitehall and Westminster and that we should have known during the BSE crisis, from start to finish, what was being told to ministers, the facts.
We certainly should have been aware of the facts. Indeed, it's difficult to see how the government, in a sense, at that time, the Conservative government, were dealing with it, because they had some more factual information than they disclosed, but not a great deal. What was clear in terms of BSE was that there was some information which was unclear that was given to ministers, and they put their own spin, if you like, on it, and they shouldn't have done that. In answer to your first question, is there a culture of secrecy at Whitehall? Well, that's the very reason that we have a manifesto commitment in order to put through this legislation for freedom of information to end the culture of secrecy.
But that is precisely what you're not going to be doing, nor are you going to ensure absolutely that in future, in the case of another BSE crisis or whatever it happens to be, we will be told the facts, because the bill does not make it obligatory, and I emphasise the word obligatory, that we should be told the facts.
Well, I think you're wrong, John. There will be a change in culture, and there will be a situation where the people of this country have a statutory right to know wherever there's a public interest in them knowing. That will be an absolute right. Wherever there is a public interest in people knowing, they will have the right to know. And what we're doing in this bill is making sure we create a balance between the right to know, which the public will have, but also the right that the public have to privacy. The government has a lot of personal information about individuals, not only their tax records, but medical and other information. Of course, they don't want journalists or anyone else to be able to have access to that. Also, there's a right to some elements of commercial confidentiality. We don't want the situation, for example, that you have in the United States, where 60% of applications under their FOI legislation is by one company trying to find out what the government knows about another company. And finally, we also need to ensure that the people have effective government. Government cannot operate in a fishbowl, and it needs to operate in a way in which civil servants can, when they give me advice which is candid and accurate, and also tells me sometimes things that perhaps as a minister I may not want to know.
Well, sure, and I accept part of that.
So there's a balance here.
Well, there's bound to be a balance, perhaps as far as advice is concerned, though many people would argue we should have that information as well. But let's deal purely with the facts. You qualified, you see, even in that answer, you qualified our right to know because you used that expression, the public interest. Well, now, who defines the public interest? The answer to that is that you, the politicians, define the public interest. You are not giving us an absolute right to know the facts.
Well, there will be an absolute right with a large amount of information to know anyway. There will also be, in a number of areas, a right which is qualified in the sense that if there is a public interest in people knowing, then they will be able to know. And in other areas, of course, as I've just explained in terms of privacy, I mean, you know, your viewers don't want to have private information held by government
that's not the question
available to you or to anyone else.
But that isn't the question that I'm asking you. The question that I'm putting to you is this. When ministers take their decisions, they rely upon a certain number of facts. We, I'm suggesting to you, should be entitled to know the facts behind the decisions that ministers take. You are saying to me very heavily, very clearly, that this is heavily qualified.
No, I'm not. I'm saying that where there is a public interest in people knowing,
Who
they
defines
will
the public
have
interest?
an absolute right to know. And in terms of deciding what the public interest is, Parliament at the end of the day will. Let me just go through the procedure here, because it's important if you're suggesting this. It's important that people understand how ministers will have their powers to restrict information very severely qualified. In other words, the people will have a right to know. In terms of factual information, for example, the only time a minister would be able to prevent the public getting information is if it came within one of the very strict exemptions within this legislation. If they took a view that that information needed in the public interest to be kept confidential, then they would have to say why. That would be open to the Information Commissioner to challenge. She would have to know all the information. She would have to accept their argument. She could then say, Elizabeth France, who's the likely Information Commissioner, she would then be able to say that that wasn't in the public interest. Then there could be an appeal to the tribunal, and if still the minister said there's a public interest and disagreed with the Information Commissioner and the tribunal, then he would have to get the consent of other cabinet ministers in order to bring before Parliament an explanation as to why that information was not in the public arena. So what we're doing is tackling in a very serious way the whole